In 2015, the U.S. military brought a 50-year-old aircraft out of retirement to fight ISIS. It made a sound completely out of place on a modern battlefield. But as two small ISIS boats speed along the Tigris River in northern Iraq, the heavily armed militants on board have no doubt as to what they've been hearing: aircraft propellers. Then they look up. A pair of small, strange-looking machines with twin booms and bulging canopies circle overhead at ominously slow speed. These are OV-10 Broncos, warbirds brought back for one last fight. And ISIS is about to find out why. Santa Ana, California, 1961. Deep in conversation were two U.S. Marine Corps majors, William H. Beckett and Knowlton Prentice Rice, known to most as KP. His full name was, in his own words, quote, "great for a congressman, but lousy for a Marine." They were doing what military men often do when they're frustrated with the powers that be, complaining about them. Beckett and Rice had flown Corsairs together in the same squadron back in 1949, but what they'd seen since then had increasingly bothered them. They believed that the Pentagon, seduced by the jet age, had become overly obsessed with sleek, supersonic fighters armed with exotic missiles, built to fight nuclear wars at high altitude over Europe. The so-called boom and zoom era was in full swing. What the U.S. was not building, in either man's opinion, was the kind of aircraft actually needed to support troops on the ground in the messy, low-tech wars that kept breaking out across Asia and Africa. Something faster than a helicopter, but slow enough to orbit a battlefield for hours. Something rugged enough to land on roads, cheap enough to station directly with frontline troops, armed with infantry weapons rather than Air Force ordnance, and with a wingspan narrow enough to fit between the trees in a jungle clearing. It was almost the polar opposite of everything the Pentagon was looking for. So the two majors decided to build it themselves, and then later figure out the far harder task of selling the idea to what Rice disdainfully referred to as the system. Working out of Rice's garage, he and Beckett set about constructing a full-scale fiberglass model of their concept aircraft, minus the wings, which wouldn't fit. The result was unlike anything in the current military inventory. Rather than a conventional fuselage, the design featured a narrow central pod, just wide enough for two tandem seats and a small cargo bay, with twin-engine booms extending outward on either side, connected at the tail by a horizontal stabilizer. The cockpit canopy bulged wider than the fuselage itself, like a greenhouse perched on a pencil. Two turboprop engines sat out on the booms. There was certainly nothing sleek or menacing about it. Just as they expected, the Pentagon was deeply skeptical. It wasn't supersonic. It didn't carry bombs. It looked like what it was: a strange contraption dreamed up by a couple of backyard inventors. But the two men refused to give up. Beckett retired from the Marines and took a job at North American Aviation to keep pushing the concept from within the industry. And slowly, the world began to catch up with their vision. By 1963, the United States was sliding deeper into Vietnam, and the jungle war taking shape there was exposing an uncomfortable gap in American air power. The existing observation aircraft, Cessna 01 Bird Dog and the O-2 Skymaster, were too slow, too lightly armed, and too fragile for the kind of flexible, lethal role the military now found itself needing. The Navy, which had initially fought the project, came around to the idea. So did the Air Force. In response, the Pentagon formally issued the Light Armed Reconnaissance Aircraft requirement, the LARA competition, opening the floor to proposals from 11 manufacturers. In the end, the contract was awarded to North American, a personal victory for Beckett. But it would come with strings attached that would transform the aircraft into quite a different beast. For the prototype, YOV-10A, the military wanted longer wings, 40 feet, instead of the original 20, twice what Beckett and Rice had specified. It wanted ejection seats, a full instrument suite, 7 external weapon stations, rough field landing gear, robust enough to satisfy Navy requirements, gear that alone added 1,000 pounds to the airframe. Then came the electronics, adding another 1,000 pounds on top of that. One by one, the features that had defined the original concept, small, simple, forward deployable, operable from roads, were quietly set aside. By the time YOV-10A performed its maiden flight on July 16, 1965, it was nearly double the size and weight of Beckett and Rice's original design. Yet while the aircraft was considerably different from the one the two men had first dreamed up 4 years earlier, Rice affirmed it was, quote, still recognizable. Its early test results were promising. Rice himself believed that despite the changes, it still showed, quote, great potential. But not everyone believed it was the best option for the role. Rival manufacturer Convair entered the Lara competition with an aircraft called the Model 48 Charger. When it failed to win, they decided to build a prototype at their own expense, hoping to eventually convince the Pentagon that it was the better design. Indeed, as testing began, it outperformed the YOV-10A in several areas. But in October 1965, the prototype's 196th test flight ended in a crash that destroyed it. With the Charger finally out of the running for good, the path was wide open for North American. After a few adjustments during testing, including a redesign of the stub wings on the fuselage bottom after weapons failed to jettison cleanly, the aircraft entered production as the OV-10 Bronco. By August 1967, the first units were rolling off the production line and would soon be thrust into exactly the kind of chaotic jungle war they'd first been envisioned for. The first 6 Broncos to reach Vietnam were Marine aircraft, arriving at Da Nang in the summer of 1968. The Air Force contingent followed weeks later, and on July 31st, the USAF formally launched Operation Combat Bronco, an operational test to determine whether this odd-looking turboprop could survive and perform in actual combat. Its mission would be that of forward air control. In the language of modern warfare, a forward air controller is the flying equivalent of an Army scout, ranging ahead of the main force, locating the enemy, and calling in heavier firepower to destroy it. Jets could fly the mission in high-threat areas, but at speed, the ground became a blur. At the other end of the spectrum, the spotter aircraft the Bronco was replacing, like the Cessna 01 Bird Dog, lacked the speed and firepower the mission increasingly demanded. The Bronco occupied a unique middle ground. Unlike jets, it could fly slow enough to allow the pilot and observer to take full advantage of its greenhouse canopy, wider than the fuselage itself, and the panoramic view that it offered of the ground below. Flying at low altitudes, Marine pilots typically flew at 1,000 to 1,500 feet. They would identify small details that no jet crew would be able to make out, even combatants' faces. They would notice everything happening around them, and over several days, pick up on patterns of activity. Marine aviator Chuck Burren recalled thinking, quote, "The farmers aren't out in the field today. Why is that?" These careful observations could prove crucial for decision-making higher up the command chain. Meanwhile, unlike the earlier spotter aircraft, the Bronco packed a powerful punch. It carried 4 7.62mm machine guns in sponsons, rocket pods, and enough external ordnance to cause serious problems for anyone caught on the receiving end. Marine aviator Dennis Darnell said, quote, "You could do quite a bit of damage while you were waiting for the heavier stuff. And if the situation was right, you wouldn't even need the heavier stuff." The Bronco had arrived in Vietnam as an experiment. Within weeks, it was something else entirely, a presence over the battlefield that the enemy had learned to fear, and the troops below had learned to trust. On January 3, 1969, in a ceremony at Naval Air Station North Island, California, the U.S. Navy established its first fixed-wing light attack squadron, Light Attack Squadron 4. They called themselves the Black Ponies. Their mission was specific. Down in the Mekong Delta, the dense, river-laced southern tip of South Vietnam, where the war was fought in swamps and canal networks, the Navy's riverine forces were struggling. Patrol boats and SEAL teams operating in the Delta needed close air support that helicopters alone couldn't provide. The Black Ponies, flying borrowed Marine OV-10As, were the answer. When they arrived in country in April 1969, operating from Bin Tai Air Base in Vung Tau, they discovered a problem nobody had anticipated. Almost nobody knew they existed. The riverine forces they'd come to support had no idea how to call for them or what they could do. So the Black Ponies did something unprecedented. They flew over friendly outposts and literally advertised themselves over the radio, reciting a canned pitch listing their capabilities, their frequencies, and the phone number for the Naval Operations Center that controlled them. A combat squadron, cold calling for customers. It didn't take long for word to spread. The Broncos' combination of long loiter time, heavy armament, and willingness to fly low made it unlike anything else available in the Delta. A standard 2-aircraft section carried 8 5-inch Zuni rockets, pods of 2 7.5-inch rockets, and either a 20mm cannon pod or additional rocket pods. The Zuni quickly became the weapon of choice. Accurate, devastating, and at night producing what pilot Daniel Sheehan described as, quote, a spectacular flame trail. Crews quickly learned to close one eye when launching, to preserve their night vision for what came next. The aircraft had to be ready to scramble around the clock. When the call came in, the front seat pilot would board, start the left engine, and run through as many checklist items as possible, while his backseater copied coordinates, frequencies, and call signs from the duty officer. Then the right engine, ordnance armed, and launch. Normal scramble time from alert to airborne was 6 to 8 minutes in daylight, 10 to 15 at night. At Bintai, they once did it in 3. On the heaviest nights, crews slept under the wings of the aircraft, rather than risk losing even those few minutes. They were writing their tactics as they went. No doctrine existed for using the Bronco as a pure attack aircraft. The Air Force and Marines used theirs primarily for forward air control. The Black Ponies were doing something different, and they knew it. Sheehan recalled, quote, we wrote the close air support tactics doctrine for the OV-10. Within weeks, the squadron that had arrived in-country, cold calling for customers, had become the most in-demand air support unit in the Delta. The first call any patrol boat commander or SEAL team leader made when things went wrong. But flying low and slow over a battlefield day after day was not without consequences. The Bronco's design gave its crews every possible advantage. The visibility, the dual controls, the ability to stay on station for hours. What it could not do was make them invulnerable. On May 25, 1969, less than 6 weeks after the Black Ponies arrived in Vietnam, that reality announced itself. 2 Black Pony OV-10s were on a routine patrol when radio calls came in from a pair of Navy River patrol boats taking fire from Viet Cong positions along the Kai Lan River. Among the crew of the lead aircraft, call sign Black Pony 107, were Pilot Lieutenant Pete Russell and his rear seat observer, Lieutenant Junior Grade Jeff Johnson. Russell was not a typical first tour aviator. On a previous deployment, flying propeller-driven A-1 Sky Raiders in the north, he had been one of 4 pilots to engage North Vietnamese MiG jets in air-to-air combat, an almost unheard-of encounter for a prop aircraft. He'd specifically chosen the Black Ponies because he preferred propeller-driven aircraft to jets. He knew exactly what kind of flying this was. The 2 OV-10s arrived on scene and immediately began working the enemy positions. Rocket attacks first. Then, when the rockets were exhausted, strafing runs with the M60 machine guns. It was on one of those strafing runs that a single 7.62mm bullet found the one gap in the canopy not covered by bulletproof glass and struck Russell in the head. Johnson, leaning forward over the pilot's seat to get a better view of the run, felt pieces of shattered plexiglass strike his face. He reached for the control stick between his legs. It offered no resistance. The aircraft was in a 240-knot dive, 30 degrees nose down, and the pilot was gone. What happened next was only possible because of a specific feature built into every OV-10 from the beginning: full dual controls in the rear cockpit. Johnson pulled back on the stick. The Bronco responded. He pulled out of the dive 35 feet above the water, barely higher than the mast of the patrol boats below, and flew the aircraft back to Bintai at full throttle, not knowing until he landed that Russell hadn't survived. Johnson later recalled, quote, "For the Black Ponies, it was a wake-up call. I think everybody now realized this was serious business." As the war escalated, both sides were determined to stay one step ahead. By 1971, the Air Force had begun quietly transforming a handful of its Broncos into something considerably more lethal. 15 aircraft of the 23rd Tactical Air Support Squadron, based at Nakhon Phanom in Thailand, were fitted with laser designator pods and LORAN navigation systems under a program called Pave Nail. Their mission was to interdict the troops and supplies flowing south along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and for the first time, the Bronco could do more than just find targets and call them in. Now, when a target was identified, the Bronco's observer could lock his laser designator onto it, and the pilot would roll into a steady orbit to hold it there. High above, an F-4 Phantom would see the orbit, release a laser-guided bomb, and follow the Bronco's laser beam straight down to the target. Many Bronco crews even turned this into a defensive tactic. Aviation historian Darrell Whitcomb, who flew these missions over the trail, explained, quote, "The enemy realized that if they saw an OV-10 go into a standard left-hand turn, the pilots maneuver to enable the backseater to designate the target. They'd better stop shooting because they were about to get hit with a laser-guided bomb." But while the Bronco was becoming more capable, the threat it faced was also escalating. North Vietnamese forces were now fielding Soviet-made SA-7 heat-seeking surface-to-air missiles, weapons that transformed the Bronco's greatest tactical advantage into its most dangerous vulnerability. For an aircraft designed to fly low and slow, a heat-seeking missile was a near-perfect counter. On June 29, 1972, Captain Stephen Bennett was flying an OV-10 FAC mission near Quang Tri City, in the northernmost part of South Vietnam, his rear seat occupied by a Marine gunfire spotter, Captain Mike Brown. For 3 hours, they'd been doing what the Bronco did best, directing naval gunfire from U.S. vessels offshore, calling in airstrikes, watching the battlefield unfold below them. Then came an urgent call. A small South Vietnamese unit was about to be overrun by a much larger North Vietnamese force. No friendly fighters were left in the area. Naval gunfire was too dangerous. The South Vietnamese were caught between the coast and the enemy, and any shot less than perfect would likely cost them their lives. There was only one man who could save them, Bennett. He rolled in and began strafing the advancing communist troops with his 4 light machine guns, the same weapons the Bronco had carried since Vietnam began, designed for marking and self-defense, not for stopping a ground assault. He made one pass, then another and another. The troops began to scatter and fall back. He kept going. On his 5th attack run, an SA-7 missile rose from behind and struck the aircraft's left engine. The explosion set the engine on fire, knocked the landing gear loose, and sent fragments tearing through both canopies. When Bennett checked on his observer, he learned that the blast had shredded Brown's parachute. He couldn't eject. The pilot of an escorting OV-10 urged Bennett to eject and save himself. The wing was in danger of exploding. Bennett refused. There was one option left: ditch the aircraft in the water. No pilot who had ever tried it in an OV-10 had lived to tell the tale. The cockpit area was known to break apart on impact. Bennett knew this. He turned south toward the Gulf of Tonkin anyway. As the aircraft touched down, the extended landing gear dug into the water. The Bronco spun left and flipped nose down into the sea. Brown escaped, but Bennett was trapped in the wreckage. His body was recovered the next day. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, the only OV-10 airman ever to receive it. The ceasefire agreement that ended American involvement in Vietnam was signed in January 1973. The Black Ponies had already been disbanded the previous April. The Air Force would keep flying Broncos for another 2 decades, but the war that had defined the aircraft was over. Yet rather than fading into storage and eventually museums, the Bronco kept finding work, in roles nobody had originally envisioned, doing jobs that nobody else could do quite as well. The U.S. Bureau of Land Management acquired 7 OV-10As for use as lead aircraft in aerial firefighting operations, flying ahead of the heavy air tankers, marking their flight paths through smoke-filled canyons, with the Bronco's existing smoke system, then pulling away as the tankers made their drops. The California Department of Forestry eventually took over the role, operating a fleet of Broncos, whose crews coordinated entire aerial firefighting operations from that distinctive greenhouse cockpit, the same panoramic visibility but it made the aircraft so effective at finding enemy troops, now turned to spotting the advancing edge of a wildfire. The U.S. Department of State put Broncos to work in South America, flying drug interdiction and coca eradication missions. The aircraft's long loader time and rough field capability making it as useful over the Andes as it had been over the Mekong Delta. NASA also acquired several for low-speed flight research. Meanwhile, the military kept developing the airframe. The OV-10D variant emerged with a visually distinctive extended nose, housing a forward-looking infrared sensor and laser designator, uprated engines, and infrared suppressive exhaust stacks to reduce its heat signature. The Vietnam-era workhorse was quietly becoming a genuine night strike platform, one that could find targets in darkness and illuminate them for laser-guided bombs. The Bronco, it turned out, still had potential that hadn't been fully explored. In August 1990, Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein's forces rolled into Kuwait, and the United States began assembling the largest military coalition since World War II. Among the units mobilized was VMO-2, one of only 2 remaining Marine Bronco squadrons. Yet rather than shipping their aircraft to the theater, 6 VMO-2 OV-10s flew themselves there. The 10,000-mile journey, which took them from Cherry Point, North Carolina, across the Atlantic, through Europe, and down to the Gulf region, made headlines in aviation publications around the world. VMO-1 followed a different route, embarking their Broncos aboard USS America and USS Theodore Roosevelt for the crossing. When Operation Desert Storm began in January 1991, Marine OV-10s were flying missions around the clock, controlling airstrikes, directing artillery, and spotting for naval gunfire, including the USS Wisconsin's first combat firing since the Korean War. The Bronco performed well throughout the campaign, but perhaps nowhere more so than on the night of February 23, 1991, the night before the ground assault began. The 1st and 2nd Marine Divisions were already inside Kuwait, breaching Iraqi minefields in the dark. Above them, an OV-10D was doing what the Bronco had always done best, loitering low, watching, piecing together the picture. In the rear seat, observer Captain Kevin Trapa had a fuller view of the battlefield than anyone on the ground. When a lead battalion, new to combat, moving fast in the darkness, called in an airstrike that would have landed on friendly positions, Trapa intervened in time. It was perhaps the purest expression of everything the Bronco was built to do. Not the fastest aircraft over the battlefield, not the most heavily armed, but the one that could see clearly enough and stay long enough to prevent a catastrophe. Yet later that week, the Bronco's weaknesses would be exposed. 2 OV-10s were shot down by Iraqi surface-to-air missiles, the same slow speed that had let Trapa watch that battlefield so clearly, now making the aircraft an easy target for modern air defenses. Both were A models, lacking the infrared countermeasures that might have saved them. Over the course of the campaign, Iraqi SAM crews targeted Marine Broncos 94 times. In a modern air defense environment, slow and low was no longer a viable tactical choice. The U.S. military retired the OV-10 in 1995. Both Marine observation squadrons were disestablished. After nearly 3 decades of continuous service, the aircraft had proved itself over jungles, river deltas, and desert battlefields was quietly withdrawn. The mission it had performed, low, slow, persistent observation and close support, was parceled out to ground units with laser designators and fast jets that could be in and out of a target area in minutes. Yet not everyone thought removing the aircraft from service was a good idea. Articles began appearing in the Marine Corps Gazette, worrying openly that nothing left in the inventory could do what the Bronco had done. The Air Force, meanwhile, began asking similar questions, and by 2009, Boeing had drawn up plans for a modernized version of the aircraft, the OV-10X, with a glass cockpit, updated sensors, and smart bomb capability. The proposal went nowhere, but the fact that it was being seriously considered said something about the gap the Bronco had left behind, and why it was about to make a secret comeback. In 2012, the U.S. military quietly acquired 2 OV-10s, one from NASA, one from the State Department, and began evaluating whether the 50-year-old design still had something to offer. By May 2015, they had their answer. Under the classified Combat Dragon 2 program, the 2 aircraft were deployed to the Middle East as part of Operation Inherent Resolve, the American-led campaign against ISIS in Iraq and Syria. Their existence in the combat theater was not announced. No press release was issued. They simply went to work. Over 82 days, they flew more than 120 combat sorties, operating largely in support of Special Forces missions. The aircraft that had once stalked Viet Cong supply boats through the Mekong Delta were now doing the same thing above the rivers of northern Iraq, and doing it with weapons their Vietnam-era predecessors could only have dreamed of. The same 275-inch rockets that had been fired over the Ho Chi Minh Trail were now fitted with laser guidance kits, accurate to within inches. One mission, flown above the Tigris River, captured everything the Bronco had always been. For 3 hours, the crew had been quietly circling at high altitude, throttled back, tracking 2 small boats carrying ISIS fighters and weapons toward the front lines. 3 hours of patience, of staying, of watching, of waiting for the right moment. When they finally rolled in, it was over in 90 seconds. 2 salvos of rockets, 2 canoes. The crew immediately pulled off, scanned for threats, and was already setting up for a second attack on a third canoe 500 yards upriver. As the mission report later noted, the engagement took place exactly 47 years to the day after the first OV-10 Bronco combat mission in 1968. Despite the experiment's success, an Air Force spokesman confirmed they were unlikely to reactivate the OV-10 on a permanent basis. The overhead cost of operating an additional aircraft type was simply too high. However, the Bronco's story wasn't quite over yet. Back in California, a different kind of mission was underway. At Chino Airport, a team of restorers had spent 18 months bringing 2 former Black Pony aircraft back to life, including Bureau number 155474, the aircraft that former Val 4 pilot Harry Gintzer had christened White Lightning in Vietnam, and in which he had flown 162 combat missions. In July 2019, White Lightning flew again for the first time in decades. It was, in its own quiet way, the perfect ending for an aircraft that had never quite accepted that it was finished. In the early 1960s, it had been rejected as too slow and simple for a military establishment that valued speed and complexity. In 1995, it had been written off as too vulnerable for the modern battlefield. And yet, it kept coming back, because the wars that kept breaking out across the world kept asking the same question, and the Bronco kept being one of the few aircraft with the right answer.